Night shift at the Blue Mill Inn. A guest picks up the phone from his room and calls the front desk. On the other end, Janet Chandler answers. At first, nothing sounds unusual. A normal late-night conversation. Quiet, routine, the kind of interaction that happens dozens of times in every roadside motel. And then something changes. There's movement in the background now. It's faint, hard to make out. Janet's voice shifts, and then the caller hears her say, "Don't take it all, sir." A few more seconds, muffled sound, confusion, and then the line goes dead. Minutes later, police pull into the parking lot of the Blue Mill Inn in Holland, Michigan. The front desk looks interrupted. Cash is missing, the safe is open, a cigarette still burns in the ashtray, but the clerk who had just answered the phone is gone. By the time the sun came up that morning, investigators believed that they understood what had happened. A robbery, an abduction, a crime committed by someone from outside the motel. But the deeper they looked at the scene, the less it behaved like one. Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, the podcast where we unravel the shadows of the human mind and dive deep into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Angela, and together we shine a light on the stories that keep us up at night. Unsolved disappearances, lives stolen too soon, and the questions that refuse to be buried.
Tonight we continue our series on the murder of Janet Chandler. In the last episode, we focused on the environment surrounding the Blue Mill Inn in January of 1979, the Chematron strike, the Wackenhut guards living inside the motel, the blurred boundaries between work, social life, and authority, and the gradual normalization of behavior that, in hindsight, should have raised more concern than it did. But tonight, we move into the crime itself, or at least the version of the crime everyone believed for years.
So this is the story investigators think they're dealing with in real time.
Exactly, because from the very beginning, this case came wrapped inside a specific explanation. Late-night robbery at a roadside motel that escalated into an abduction. And at first glance, that explanation makes sense. There's a phone call, missing cash, the clerk disappears into the middle of the night. That's enough to create a framework, and once that framework forms, then everything else starts getting interpreted through it.
Including things that maybe don't fully fit.
Exactly. And that's really what this episode is about. It's not proving what happened to Janet Chandler, and it's not jumping ahead to what we know now, but it's looking carefully at the original narrative itself, how it formed, why it held, and why some of the details inside it never fully behaved like a robbery at all. Because when investigators arrived at the Blue Mill Inn that night, they weren't walking into a solved mystery. They were walking into a scene that only appeared to explain itself. And underneath that explanation, something else was already there. Sometime after 2 a.m., we're at the Blue Mill Inn, Holland, Michigan. A call comes into police dispatch, and it's somebody reporting a possible robbery in progress at the motel. And that caller is a Wackenhut security guard.
So before officers even arrive, they already think that they know what they're responding to.
Exactly. And that's important because from the very beginning, the case comes with a label attached to it already, and that is robbery. Now, what the caller claims is that another guard had been on the phone with Janet at the front desk, and during that conversation, something changed. He heard movement in the background, confusion, and then he said that he heard Janet say, "Don't take it all, sir." And a few seconds later, the line was disconnected.
So from the caller's perspective, this sounds like someone interrupting a robbery in real time.
Right. And if you're dispatch hearing that call in 1979, it makes sense. You've got a late night motel, a young female clerk all alone, money is on site, and then the sudden disconnect of the phone call, it really does fit a recognizable pattern. Mm-hmm. But there's an important detail here. Police are not walking into a silent scene and independently concluding this looks like a robbery. Because like you said a minute ago, they're arriving at the scene already primed to see a robbery, right? because someone inside of that environment has already pretty much set the scene for them.
And at this point, they have no reason to distrust that.
None. Not initially. The caller sounds concerned. He's coherent. He's helpful. He's not saying, I was involved. He's positioning himself as a witness, and he's a security guard, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the sentence itself. Don't take it all, sir. That line becomes central to the original understanding of the case because it explains the missing money before officers even get to the desk.
But hearing it now, it almost sounds too perfect.
Yeah, it does. Especially in hindsight, because it's unusually specific. It's not help, someone's here, call the police. Specifically, it's about money, taking it all. It's a sentence that immediately directs attention towards robbery. So within minutes, officers arrive at the Blue Mill Inn, and like we've said, at first glance, the scene appears to support exactly what they were told. The front office is mildly disturbed. The safe is open. There's $500 missing from the safe. Janet is gone. Her cigarette is still smoldering in the ashtray. So that tells you how quickly they got there afterwards, right? The robbery narrative is reinforced.
So now the physical scene is matching the story they were already given.
Right. And once that starts happening, then a framework forms very quickly. But beneath that framework, there are details that don't sit quite right. That cigarette burning in the ashtray is one of them. And her coat is draped over the chair behind the desk, and her purse is missing. Small details, easy to overlook, but behaviorally, they do matter.
Because that sounds less like someone being dragged out in a panic and more like someone stepping away briefly.
Right. Those details suggest interruption, but not necessarily alarm. A person that left and expected to come right back. And that's important because whatever happened to Janet that night does not appear to fully unfold at that desk itself. And there's another issue. The Blue Mill Inn isn't empty. We've discussed that. Guards are living there, but there's no reports of screaming or any kind of a struggle or any chaos at all coming from that lobby.
So if someone forcibly abducts her from the front desk, they do it without drawing attention in a full motel.
Right. And when you say full motel, it's a full motel. We talked about that in the first episode. Like, it is completely full. So that means one of two things. Either this happened very, very quickly, very quietly, and with a very, very high degree of control, or at least initially, it didn't look like an abduction at all. And so this is where the case starts becoming way more complicated, because the deeper that you look at the original robbery narrative, the more you realize that it's built almost entirely from information coming from inside of that same social environment that we talked about in the last episode, but the investigators had no way of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the guards that are literally filling the motel. This whole incestuous deal that we talked about last episode with the guards and the locals and the staff of the motel, these overlapping relationships, people living and socializing together for weeks at this point, all inside of that one closed system.
So the first version of this crime is being written by the same environment the crime came out of.
Right. And at the time, that is not obvious. To police, it still looks like a robbery, an abduction, an unknown offender, but underneath that explanation, small inconsistencies are already starting to surface. The story makes sense at first glance until you stop and you look at who told it first. So when officers entered the Blue Mill Inn that night, the scene appeared to confirm, like we said, what they already knew. The clerk was gone, the cash was missing, the office looked disturbed. So the robbery framework was definitely reinforced once they got on scene.
So now they're not just relying on the phone call anymore. The physical scene seems to support it.
Right. And that's important to understand fairly, because If you're a responding officer in Holland, Michigan in 1979, this does not look irrational at first pass. Like we said, you've got a lone clerk there. There's money missing. You have somebody that's reporting this interrupted phone call. You have no suspect on site. Nothing's visible. There's no recognizable pattern. But the deeper that you sit with the scene, the stranger that it starts to feel. Like we discussed in episode 1, the Blue Mill front office is not large. It's a small roadside motel lobby, fluorescent lighting, the front counter dividing the room. There's a clerk space behind the counter, guest space in front of the counter, glass windows that face the parking lot. It's functional, it's exposed. It's difficult to hide movement in.
So if something violent happens here, it's likely that it's probably noticeable.
Right. Especially because this isn't an isolated building. Like we've talked about time and time again, it's completely full of people, which means investigators are walking into a scene that should theoretically carry some emotional residue of violence. But instead, the room feels strangely still. Janet's coat draped over the chair, her cigarette still burning, her purse gone. The lighting is bright. The room is quiet. The papers are disturbed just enough to suggest there was some kind of an interruption, but not chaos.
It almost sounds less like a crime scene and more like someone stepped away in the middle of work.
Right. And behaviorally, that's important because those details would suggest a temporary absence, not immediate terror, a person expecting to return to the desk. And I think what's really important is, as a woman, if you're being abducted, do you stop to grab your purse?
No. You kick, you scream, you claw, Yeah,
you knock papers off of the desk and
Well, and the true crime brain, you're leaving as much evidence and DNA as you possibly can behind.
Absolutely. But even outside of the true crime brain, I think that that's just normal human
You're still
reaction.
Kicking, screaming, yeah.
Especially, and I think that this is what stands out to me more than anything is knowing the environment in that motel where she is like close with almost every guest in the place. She would feel very comfortable screaming for help. At that point, it would be almost like screaming for your family to come and help you, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that it's important also to talk about what the officers arriving don't find. And that is they find no shattered glass. They find no overturned furniture, no obvious signs of any kind of a struggle, or no witnesses saying, I heard somebody screaming, I heard fighting, I heard banging, I heard panic, nothing like that.
So if this is a stranger robbery that turns into an abduction, it happens very quietly.
Extremely quietly, which really creates a problem like we were just talking about, because a random offender forcing a clerk out of a motel lobby usually introduces chaos. There's going to be raised voices, and not just from Janet. Usually when somebody comes in to commit a robbery, they're not whispering, give me all your money.
And come with me.
I mean, they're usually yelling or at least talking in a very high voice, right? They're barking commands.
Yeah.
Janet is putting up at least
Exuding
initial
authority.
Right. Janet's going to be putting up at least initial resistance. And the whole thing is based on speed. It's not being quiet. This is kind of what you would describe as a smash and grab style of robbery. This is not, you don't walk into the bank and hand the teller a note. This is, we need to get into this motel and out with the cash as fast as possible. So they're not worried about being quiet or not messing anything up. Their concern is getting in and out. But the Blue Mill scene does not carry that kind of energy. It carries maybe interruption, but not eruption. And so this is where that distinction really becomes important, because there is a difference between a room where violence occurred and a room that's arranged to explain violence after the fact.
So you're saying the office may be communicating something intentionally?
Potentially. Because several details work together almost too neatly. You have missing cash, the open safe, the missing purse, the interrupted phone call that says, "Don't take it all, sir," all reinforcing that same narrative direction of robbery.
And investigators receive all of that before they understand the social environment surrounding the motel.
100%. At this stage, police still see the Blue Mill as just a normal motel. A victim.
It's actually a frat house.
Right. They see a victim, an unknown offender. They do not see this enclosed social ecosystem that has overlapping loyalties and internal friction and relationships, and they don't see the mess that it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be the most important part of the entire scene, because the original robbery narrative, like we said, does not organically emerge from the forensic evidence. It's being delivered to them through that phone call, through the staging, through the interruption attached to the scene before the officers even arrive.
So from the very beginning, investigators are looking at the room through someone else's explanation of it.
Right. And once that framework locks in, then every detail starts organizing itself around it. Missing money becomes motive, disappearance becomes abduction, silence becomes evidence of a fast-moving stranger attack. But underneath all of it, the room itself is already hinting at something else entirely. Because what's missing from the Blue Mill lobby that night is the violence that the story requires. About 24 hours after Janet Chandler disappears from the Blue Mill Inn, a snowplow driver makes a discovery along Interstate 196. It's about 1:30 in the morning, deep winter. Snow is still lining the median and the shoulders along the interstate. He's operating, like I said, a snowplow near Covert Township, roughly 35 to 40 miles south of Holland.
So this isn't just roadside shoulder a few exits away.
No, it's a long distance. Deliberate movement away from the hotel, enough separation that it's important. Now, near the median, the driver notices tracks cutting into an emergency turnout area near a wooded edge. There's a fresh disturbance in the snow. It's localized. It's recent. And this guy, I got to tell you, I got to say, this dude, first of all, he has like brass balls the size of basketballs. Mm-hmm. And he's like a true freaking hero, because his initial reaction isn't like keep plowing the road like I think most everybody's reaction would be. His reaction is, it's wintertime, it's cold, it's snowing. Somebody might be in trouble and they might need help. I need to go figure out what's going on, which I don't think he gets enough credit for. So he stops his plow, he gets his flashlight, and he goes to see what's at the end of these tracks because he's worried about somebody. He has like the highway noise behind him. You know, there's a big snowbank that's rising in front of him in the turnout. And then he sees an arm that's protruding from the snow. Janet Chandler's body has been mostly buried in that snowdrift right at that turnout.
So immediately with that, this stops looking like a robbery escalation.
Right, because at that point, the shape of this crime changes dramatically. I really should have given a trigger warning every episode. I do got to say, this case is awful. What we have to discuss is awful. Mm-hmm. Most of that is going to come in episode 3, but as you and the listeners know, I like to give you a heads up. I forgot to do it in episode 1. I like to give you a heads up so you don't get all invested in the story and then not be able to listen to the rest of it. I will say that this next episode, episode 3, is going to be one of, if not the worst discussions of sexual violence that we've ever discussed and probably that I've ever heard of. So I'm going to put that out there. And I wanted to give the trigger warning at this point, and then definitely before next episode, you're going to hear me say that again. So before we move forward, I want to take a quick moment. Dark Dialogue has grown into more than just a single show. Everything that we do, from the full investigations to breakdowns and follow-ups, is all built to give these cases the time and the attention that they deserve. If you want to go deeper or support what we're building, the website is the central hub for everything. That's where you'll find bonus content, extended material, and ways to directly support the show. All of it is in one place so that you're not chasing links all across different platforms. All right, so let's get back to the case. Janet is found nude, partially buried in that snowbank. There's drag marks that are visible nearby. Investigators also identify tire tracks leading into that turnout area. And there's an important detail here. The snow coverage on her body appears lighter than the snow accumulation in the surrounding area, which obviously suggests that she probably hadn't been there all night.
So now investigators are looking at transport, concealment, and timing, not just abduction.
Right. Whoever left Janet there obviously had access to a vehicle. They moved her a significant distance, 35 to 40 miles for a robbery turned murder is unbelievably long distance. I mean, usually a crime like that, you're going to find the body relatively close to town. There's no attachment to the body. And, you know, for anybody that doesn't know, just taking a body 35 to 40 miles away usually indicates personal knowledge because you're trying to create distance between you and the victim. Finding the victim relatively close often suggests a stranger abduction because if they find the body, they're not going to tie it to you because you're a stranger. So it really speaks a lot to me looking at this case in hindsight. I don't know how much it said to investigators then, but I will say I'm not going to attack investigators in this case at all. So anything that I say about the investigation is not an attack because I do think they really cared and they really tried.
Okay. That's kind of refreshing.
It won't be the same when in Rocky Mountain Reckoning. I've got a lot to say about the dumbass piece of shit investigators.
There's always going to be some. Always.
Yes. But we also know that whoever dumped her body chose a specific location off the interstate and spent at least some amount of time burying the body. Now, it's buried in snow, so it's not like they're digging a hole in the ground, but still, they didn't just like throw her and run. You know, they were there for a little bit. Even if the concealment itself is rushed, it did take a little bit of time. This is where the original robbery narrative really starts developing some major structural problems, like I already alluded to a little bit, but a straightforward motel robbery already carries risks, but abducting the clerk and transporting her 35 to 40 miles, stripping her nude, partially concealing her body in a remote snowbank is a very, very different behavioral profile from a robber.
And that's a huge escalation for just a few $100s from a motel register.
Right. The risk begins outweighing the reward almost immediately, which really raises a critical question. And that is if money was really, truly the motive or not. And if it was, why continue escalating after the cash is already in your possession? Like you have her and you have the money. Why do you strip her, kill her, drive her 40 miles? It doesn't make sense. And the location is important because this isn't a random roadside ditch. It's an emergency turnaround off I-196, a semi-hidden piece of highway infrastructure near the wooded median, the kind of place that you're more likely to use if you know that corridor, you travel it regularly, or you feel comfortable moving through it at night.
So this is starting to look less like a passing drifter and more like someone familiar with the environment.
Potentially, yeah. At a minimum, it suggests a level of comfort and mobility that doesn't fully align with the panicked stranger trying to flee a robbery scene story. Now, up to this point, the Blue Mill front office has been doing most of the talking. You've got the open safe, the missing cash, the interrupted phone call, the staged disturbance, all of it reinforcing robbery, but the body scene communicates something else entirely. Here, we have sexual violence, control, transport, concealment, real time invested in disposing of this victim.
So the front desk tells one story and the dump site tells another.
Exactly. And investigators now have to reconcile those two scenes. One, a bright, still motel office that appears interrupted, and the other, a naked body hidden in a snowbank off a winter highway. Those are not naturally connected scenes. And psychologically, this should have changed the investigation significantly, because once Janet is found, this is no longer a robbery with a missing clerk, a possible kidnapping, because it is now a transported homicide involving sexual violence and post-crime concealment. And like I said a minute ago, the offender profile really should begin changing at this point. The motive structure should begin changing, and the original robbery explanation should already be under some serious pressure.
But even then, the robbery framework still survives.
It does. And partially because the original narrative arrived so early in the investigation, and partially because investigators are still operating inside of incomplete information, and partially because the people closest to the truth remain inside the same closed social incestuous mess that's surrounding the Blue Mill Inn. But by the time Janet Chandler is found, the robbery narrative is no longer holding the evidence together cleanly. At best, it explains the opening moments. It does not explain what followed, not the transport, not the nudity, not the concealment, not the distance, not the level of control involved.
So now the front desk starts looking less like the crime itself and more like a layer placed over it.
Right. Because the deeper investigators move into the physical evidence, the harder it becomes to ignore what the two scenes are really saying together. The front desk and the snowbank are two ends of the same story, one constructed to explain the crime and the other exposing what the crime actually was. This is where the investigative frameworks kind of become dangerous. One theory forms early enough, and then new evidence always gets interpreted through that theory instead of used to test it.
So instead of asking whether the robbery theory still works, investigators start fitting new facts inside it.
Right. Janet's body isn't treated as evidence that the original story may be fundamentally wrong. Instead, the homicide gets absorbed into the robbery narrative itself. Robbery becomes robbery plus kidnapping, robbery plus murder, robbery plus sexual assault, instead of maybe robbery was never the real crime at all. And part of the problem is that investigators really misunderstood what the Blue Mill Inn actually is. They see a normal motel with employees and guests, but we talked about what was happening at the Blue Mill Inn. It is not a motel anymore. It's functioning like an ecosystem.
More like a temporary company town than a business.
Right. Dozens of Wackenhut guards living on site, shared drinking, overlapping sexual relationships, internal hierarchies, people rotating between the strike line and the motel. The same individuals are working together, socializing together, sleeping together, protecting each other, all inside one compressed environment. And the guard culture itself matters here, because these are men brought into this hostile strike environment, trained around discipline, loyalty, and unit cohesion. And that mentality becomes protect the group, don't break the ranks. Outsiders don't understand what happens inside.
So once the crime happens, the same culture starts protecting the narrative.
Right. The robbery explanation becomes more than a theory. It becomes defensive structure, a story capable of protecting reputations, jobs, relationships, and eventually freedom. But the silence surrounding the case isn't simple. Not everyone at the Blue Mill Inn is operating from the same level of guilt. Some people are directly involved. Some people are terrified. Some are minimizing what they know. Some are trying to survive socially and economically. And that creates a very particular kind of witness environment.
Not one giant conspiracy, but layers of fear, self-protection, and half-truths.
Right. People sanitize stories,
Yeah.
minimize relationships, soften timelines, leave pieces out. Nobody volunteers the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
And fragmented truth is much harder to investigate. And this may be the biggest investigative blind spot of all. The people closest to the truth are also the people defining the environment for the investigators. The guards are the ones that explain the robbery. The guards dominate the motel. The guards shape the social atmosphere. The guards influence what other witnesses feel safe saying, meaning that the framework itself is being stabilized from inside that same ecosystem that produced the crime.
So investigators are trying to understand the environment while the environment is actively controlling what they can see.
Exactly. And in 1979, there's very little conceptual framework for what this case actually is. A coordinated group sexual assault and homicide involving security guards and motel staff is nowhere that investigators are going to instinctively go. Stranger robbery is, because stranger robbery is recognizable. It's something you're familiar with. It's something you've at least heard of before.
Yeah.
And over time, the framework calcifies. Contradictions remain on file, timeline inconsistencies, behavioral mismatches, social overlap, weak robbery logic, but all of it stays categorized under the same heading of robbery kidnapping.
So the truth is technically in the case file, but trapped inside the wrong story.
Right. And by the early 1980s, the Janet Chandler investigation isn't just cold, it's frozen inside a narrative that no longer matches the evidence, but still controls how that evidence gets interpreted. And that's where the case stays for decades. Because sometimes cases don't remain unsolved because the truth just disappears. They remain unsolved because the wrong explanation hardens around it first.
It's just insane to me.
Yeah, it's going to get worse. So in the weeks after Janet's murder, the investigation really moved aggressively. It involved local police, state investigators, federal agencies. At one point, 20 investigators are working on the case. They did hundreds of interviews. They conducted polygraph examinations, built timelines, interviewed the motel staff, the guards, the strike workers, family members. This was not an agency that was sitting on their hands not doing shit. I mean, that's what I say. Like, they brought in the FBI, they brought in the state. I mean, they did what they could do.
So initially, this isn't being ignored.
No, her murder is taken very seriously.
Which is the only refreshing thing in this whole story.
Right. Investigators know that they're dealing with something major, but there's a difference between working hard and working from the right framework. And within months, the investigation starts running into the same problem repeatedly. Nobody breaks. Witnesses maybe offer fragments. Rumors are circulating. Timelines blur. Stories soften around the edges, but nobody provides any kind of coherent alternative to that robbery narrative.
So even though investigators feel contradictions, they still don't have another story strong enough to replace the first one.
Right. I mean, shit was happening. Like, somebody in a bar heard something happened and reported it.
Mm-hmm.
Cops can't act on that. I mean, they can go find the person at the bar and
try.
Yeah. Or, I mean, even if they actually do and they set that person down and they're like, oh yeah, I was drunk and talking shit. What do you do at that point? How do you push it further than that? And the robbery explanation remains the only complete narrative that they had available, not because it perfectly fits the evidence, but because nothing else fully surfaces to challenge it. And then, and this part is extraordinarily important to this case, because that weird social incestuous mess of the environment starts to dissolve. The Chematron strike winds down, the Wackenhut contract ends, and the guards leave Michigan and scatter back all over the country. The Blue Mill Inn slowly returns to being just an ordinary roadside motel, new guests, new staff, normal traffic moving through the lobby again. It goes back to normal.
So the world that produced the crime disappears before investigators ever fully understand it.
Yeah, and in complete honesty, a lot of the guards are gone before cops even had an opportunity to interview them.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're not talking months and months and months or years and years. They're gone relatively quickly after the crime. So by, like I said, the early 1980s, detectives are trying to reconstruct this temporary social system that no longer exists anymore. The physical motel still remains there, but that ecosystem is gone. And this is where a case quietly becomes cold, not in any kind of one dramatic moment, and not because investigators suddenly stop caring, but because leads stop moving, witnesses disperse, contradictions stop generating traction, the task force shrinks and then it shrinks again, and eventually Janet Chandler's murder becomes an open case, but without any active momentum.
Officially alive, but operationally frozen.
That's a great way to say it, yes. And over time, the silence surrounding the case changes too. Early, silence is often fear, but decades later, it becomes something a lot more complicated. Shame, self-protection, compartmentalization, stories repeated so many times that they begin replacing the actual memories themselves.
Yeah, so eventually people may not even remember the raw events anymore, just the version they've lived with.
Exactly.
I've had that happen.
Yes. I mean, it explains the Mandela effect. It's not how you say it. Mandela. That explains the Mandela effect. And that's essentially what we're talking about here, right? Is memories are being replaced.
That's how I remember it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it was a robbery. It was just a party. I wasn't really involved. I didn't know how bad it was. And those narratives harden over the years. And the longer the time, the more they harden. And once they harden, they become psychologically very difficult to break, even for the people telling them. Somewhere in Holland, the case file keeps growing. Hundreds of pages, interview notes, photographs, conflicting statements, unresolved contradictions. But all of it remains organized under that same central framework: robbery, kidnapping, homicide. It really might be one of the most important things to understand about this case is that, the cops had it, they were working it, they were trying, but this is a very unique situation. I mean, it's like, you have a murder in the town and then the whole town leaves.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, I'm sure it was somebody in town, but they're all gone. So how do it's a difficult freaking situation. Janet Chandler is not forgotten. Her family certainly doesn't forget. Those poor people, they go through hell. Oh God, I can't either. Investigators don't fully forget. Rumors around the Blue Mill Inn never fully disappear. The truth is still there. It's fragmented across memories, guilt, silence, rumor, but nothing has enough force to break the framework open. And over time, the robbery story settles into the community almost like sediment. Not because everyone fully believes it, but because it's stable. It's easier than confronting the alternative, that a young woman was lured from her workplace by people that she knew inside a social environment that protected itself afterwards.
So the case doesn't disappear.
No, it freezes. So by the early 80s, her murder exists in two forms at once. Publicly, an unsolved robbery homicide tied to a roadside motel. And then underneath, a fractured, partially hidden truth circulating through rumor, fear, memory, and silence. Investigators feel pieces of it. Witnesses carry pieces of it. The community hears pieces of it, but there's nobody that can force those pieces together to fit in any kind of cohesive manner.
And eventually people start living inside the wrong story because it's the only story that still moves.
Right. And that's where Janet Chandler's case remains for more than 2 decades. Not erased, not solved, frozen inside a narrative that explained enough to survive, but not enough to hold. Because sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just waits for enough pressure to crack the story that's built around it. For more than 20 years, Janet Chandler's case remains trapped inside a story that never fully fit the evidence. The file stays open, rumors continue circulating, investigators carry doubts that they can't fully prove, and somewhere underneath all of that, the real story waits. It's not gone, it's waiting. Waiting for enough time, enough distance, enough pressure for the silence surrounding the Blue Mill Inn to finally begin to crack.
And eventually, someone starts asking the right questions.
Right. But in 1979, that moment is still decades away. Before Janet Chandler became a cold case, a documentary, a reopened investigation, she was a 22-year-old woman from Hudsonville, Michigan, a daughter, a student, a friend, someone trying to build a future beyond the night shift desk at the Blue Mill Inn. This is You're Not Alone by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Janet Chandler. There's something especially difficult about looking at Janet Chandler's life through the lens of what eventually happened to her. Because once a case becomes known publicly, once it becomes headlines, documentaries, court testimony, true crime retellings, the violence starts pulling everything towards itself. And slowly, almost without realizing it, people stop imagining the ordinary parts of someone's life. But Janet's life was mostly made up of ordinary things. School, work, family, plans for the future, long shifts, conversations with friends, trying to move forward one step at a time like millions of other young people her age. She wasn't living inside a crime story. She was living inside a life that still felt unfinished and open. And maybe that's one of the reasons that this case stays with people the way it does, because nothing about Janet Chandler sounds like someone standing at the edge of catastrophe. She sounds familiar. A young woman trying to build independence, trying to make responsible decisions, trying to balance adulthood, work, and college at the same time. There's no evidence that she walked into the Blue Mill Inn that winter believing she was entering danger. If anything, the opposite seems true. The people around her were becoming familiar. The routines were becoming familiar. The environment itself was becoming normal. And that's part of what makes this case so heartbreaking. The threat didn't arrive as something obvious. It emerged slowly from people and dynamics that had stopped feeling dangerous long before they actually became dangerous. And when you study cases like this long enough, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. Human beings are incredibly vulnerable to environments that train them not to recognize escalating risk. Especially young people, especially people trying to belong socially, especially people working inside temporary cultures where boundaries erode little by little instead of all at once. Janet Chandler should have had decades more life after January 1979. more birthdays, more relationships, more mistakes, more ordinary mornings nobody would ever remember because she was still alive to experience them. Maybe marriage, maybe children, maybe an entirely different career years later. The point is, she should have had the chance to become someone older than 22. And instead, for more than 2 decades, the public version of her story remained trapped inside a narrative that reduced her life to a roadside motel robbery. But Janet Chandler was never just the victim in an unsolved case. She was a daughter whose family spent years carrying unanswered grief, a student whose future stopped in the middle of being built, a human being who deserved dignity long before anyone ever decided to investigate what was done to her properly. And maybe the hardest part of all of this is understanding how many people continued living after that night carrying pieces of the truth, while Janet herself never got the chance to continue to live at all. The people around this case aged. They moved away, they built families, they changed jobs, they tried to bury memories, but Janet stayed 22 forever. And that's what murder actually takes from someone. Not just a life in the present, an entire future that never gets the opportunity to exist. So tonight, before we move further into the investigation in the next episode, before the interviews, the pressure, the collapsing stories, and the eventual reckoning, it matters to stop for a moment and remember the person at the center of all of it. Not the case, not the rumors, not the mythology that formed around the Blue Mill Inn, just Janet, a young woman from Hudsonville, Michigan, who should have been allowed to grow older, who should have been allowed to leave that motel at the end of her shift and continue living the rest of her life, and who deserved far better from the people around her than what she received that winter night in 1979.